A cowboy found a sweet little girl hiding in his barn. What she said made him speechless. The storm hit hard just past midnight. Rain hammered the roof of the Double Star Ranch like it had a grudge against the place. Thunder rolled across the flat Texas prairie in long, low waves, shaking the barn walls and rattling every loose board. Lightning split the sky every few minutes, bright and white and mean, turning the darkness into something that flickered like a broken lantern. Inside the tack room at the back of the barn, Luke Harlan slept on a narrow cot with his boots still on and his hat pulled down over his face. A saddle blanket covered him to the waist. The room smelled of leather oil, dry hay, and the particular kind of quiet that only exists in places where animals are kept. A single tin lantern hung from a nail above the door, its flame turned low, barely enough to throw shadows. Luke was 44 years old, though he looked older on hard mornings. His face was weathered and creased, the kind of face that had been through weather and war, and too many nights sleeping rough. His shoulders were broad, and his hands were rough, the knuckles scarred in ways that no ranch job had caused. He was not a small man, but he had a habit of making himself small, of staying quiet, of choosing corners over center rooms, and cots over proper beds. Before you continue listening, please let me know where in the world are you watching from today. Now back to the story. He had slept in bunkhouses before. He had been offered a real room in the ranch house more than once. Martha Reed, the cook, had practically ordered him inside on cold nights, waving her wooden spoon and telling him he was being foolish. But Luke always found a reason to come back to the tack room, back to the saddles and the bridles and the smell of horses. It was easier here, quieter in the way that mattered. At the far end of the barn, past 3 empty stalls, Rusty shifted and stamped. The old red horse did not like storms. He never had. He was a big animal, deep-chested with a white blaze down his nose, and he carried himself with the kind of steady dignity that old horses earn after years of hard use. His coat was the deep, warm red of autumn clay. His mane was darker, almost brown at the roots. He was not a young horse anymore, and he moved with the careful slowness of age. But his eyes were still sharp, and when something troubled him, he let you know. He stamped again. Luke did not stir. He had learned to sleep through Rusty's restlessness during storms. The horse would settle. He always did. Thunder cracked directly overhead, loud enough to feel in the chest. The lantern flame jumped. Rain began finding a new leak somewhere in the roof, dripping in a fast, steady tap against the wooden floor. Luke pulled the saddle blanket up a little higher. Then he heard something else. It was soft, almost too soft to catch over the rain. He thought at first it was the wind pushing through a gap in the siding, the way it sometimes did, making a sound that was almost like a voice. He had heard that before. He ignored it. But then the sound came again, and this time it had shape. Words. A child's voice. Trembling and very small, but unmistakable. Luke went still. He lay there for a moment without breathing, listening hard. The rain kept falling. Rusty had gone quiet, and underneath all of it, that small voice continued in a broken, whispering prayer. Luke sat up slowly. He set his hat aside and swung his boots to the floor. He reached up and turned the lantern up just enough to carry a little light. Then he pushed open the tack room door and stepped out into the barn. The lantern light reached just far enough. There, kneeling in the wet straw beside Rusty's stall, was a little girl. She was soaked through to the bone. Her dress was dark with rain and mud from the hem to the collar. Her hair hung in flat, wet ropes against her cheeks. She was small, even for a child, and thin in a way that made something tighten in Luke's chest. Her hands were pressed together in her lap, and her head was bowed, and one small pale hand rested gently against Rusty's leg. Rusty stood completely still above her. The horse was not stamping. He was not nervous. He was simply standing there, calm and quiet, letting the child lean against him in the dark. Luke stopped walking. The girl did not hear him. She kept praying, her voice shaking with cold and exhaustion, each word careful and earnest the way children's prayers are when they mean every syllable. "Lord, I found the red horse. Please let the man be kind." Luke stood in the lantern light with his mouth open and no words coming out. The girl finally sensed him. She turned her head slowly, the way frightened animals do when they already know something is there and are just deciding whether to run. Her eyes were large and dark with shadows beneath them. Her lips were pale. She looked at Luke for a long moment without speaking. Then she said, in a voice barely above a whisper, "Are you the man who lives with the red horse?" Luke managed a single nod. The girl let out a long, shaking breath, like she had been holding it for 3 days. "My name is Clara May," she said. "My mama died on the trail. She told me to walk until I found the man with the red horse." She paused, swallowing hard. "She said he owed my papa a promise." Luke felt the words hit him somewhere behind the ribs. He did not move. He tried to think of the right thing to say. He thought about every debt he had ever carried, every face he had ever tried to forget, every name that surfaced on bad nights when the sleep would not come. He could not place this. He did not know a Clara May. He did not know her mama. He did not know what promise she was talking about. He opened his mouth to tell her so, but Clara spoke first. "Mama said I would know the right horse," she said quietly. "She said to look for the silver star burned into the saddle." The words landed like a stone dropped into still water. Luke turned his head slowly toward the far wall of the tack room, where Rusty's old saddle hung on its wooden peg. He had owned that saddle for so long, he stopped seeing it years ago. The leather was dark with age and oil, the stitching worn smooth in places, the fenders creased from 1,000 miles of riding. Lightning flashed through the barn's high window. In that single white burst of light, Luke saw it. There on the saddle's skirt, half hidden beneath years of grime and old leather dressing, was a small brand, a star, 6 points, no bigger than a man's thumb, with a thin silver tack driven into its center that caught the light like a coin. Luke stared at it. The light died. The barn went dark again, except for the lantern. Rain pounded the roof. Thunder growled in the distance. Luke could not speak. Luke crossed the barn in 4 long strides and crouched down beside Clara in the wet straw. Up close, she looked even smaller. Her shoulders were shaking hard. Her lips had gone the faint blue color of cold milk. When he reached out and touched her arm, her skin felt like creek water in January. "Can you stand?" he asked. She tried. Her legs buckled before she got halfway up. Luke caught her without thinking. He tucked the lantern handle over his wrist, slid one arm beneath her knees, and lifted her against his chest. She weighed almost nothing. That fact alone bothered him more than he could say. Clara made a small sound, and then went still against his shoulder. Rusty moved. The old horse stepped sideways along the stall railing, following them, his big head stretching over the gate. Luke took one step toward the barn door, and Rusty stamped hard, once, then again, not in fear, in insistence. Luke stopped and looked back. The horse had his nose extended toward Clara, nostrils wide, ears forward. He was watching her the way he watched things he did not want to lose sight of. Clara's hand, hanging limp at her side, brushed against Rusty's nose. The horse went still immediately, completely still. Luke stood there for a moment in the leaking barn with rain hammering the roof, and a half-frozen child in his arms, and his old red horse watching him with dark, steady eyes. "I'll bring her back," he said quietly. He did not know why he said it to a horse. It felt like the right thing to say. He turned and pushed through the barn door into the storm. The rain hit hard. It was the kind of cold rain that soaks through a coat in 10 seconds and does not stop. Luke ducked his head and crossed the yard at a fast walk, keeping Clara pulled close against his chest to block the wind from her. She shivered against him, but did not wake. Her wet hair pressed against his jaw. The ranch kitchen was in the back of the main house, attached by a covered walkway that gave him a little shelter in the last stretch. He hit the kitchen door with his shoulder and pushed it open. The room was dark, except for the orange glow of the banked stove. It smelled of coffee and cornbread and something that had been simmering earlier in the evening. Luke set Clara down carefully in the wide chair beside the stove and straightened up. "Martha." "Nothing." "Martha Reed." A thump from the back room. Then footsteps, quick and purposeful. Martha appeared in the doorway with a shawl thrown over her nightgown and her gray hair loose around her shoulders. She was a broad, solid woman with capable hands and sharp eyes that missed very little. She took one look at the child in the chair and crossed the kitchen without a word. She pressed the back of her hand to Clara's forehead, then her cheek, then the side of her neck. "Build that fire up," she said to Luke. He was already moving toward the stove. Martha was pulling blankets from the cedar chest under the window before the fire had caught. She wrapped Clara from the shoulders down, tucking the edges in tight, then turned to the pump and filled the soup pot with water. She set it on the stove, moved to the bread box, came back with a cloth and began working Clara's ruined shoes off her feet. One of them had split along the sole so badly that the leather peeled back like bark from a wet log. Martha looked at that shoe for just a moment. Then she set it down very gently, like it was something that deserved care. She did not say anything. She did not need to. Luke fed more wood into the stove and stood back. He watched Martha work with the quiet efficiency of a woman who had tended to more than one person in bad shape and knew exactly what each minute cost. Clara stirred after a while, not fully awake, but surface close. Her eyes opened halfway and found Martha's face. "There now," Martha said softly. "You are safe inside. Nobody is going to hurt you." Clara's eyes moved around the kitchen slowly. They settled on Luke standing in the doorway. She blinked at him. "I walked 3 nights," she said. Her voice was rough and thin. "After Mama died on the trail, she made me keep going." She stopped and swallowed. "She said find the red horse. She said the man with the red horse would remember." Luke did not move from the doorway. "She gave me all the food we had left," Clara continued, her voice getting slower with each word. "And she said not to stop." Her eyelids were dropping. "She said not to let anyone take me back to the Bible box lady." Her head tilted against the blanket. "Please," she murmured, "don't send me back to her." Then she was asleep. Fully and completely, the way exhausted children fall, all at once, like a candle going out. The kitchen was quiet except for the fire popping in the stove and the rain against the window. Luke stood in the doorway with his wet coat dripping on the floorboards, looking at the sleeping child, turning the words over in his mind. The Bible box lady. He did not know what it meant, but the fear in Clara's voice before sleep took her, had been real. The kind of fear that does not come from imagination. It comes from memory. The storm had pulled back by the time Luke crossed the yard again. It was still dripping from every surface. The eaves, the fence posts, the bare branches of the cottonwood beside the water trough. But the hard driving rain was gone. The sky was the pale gray of an old sheet, and the mud sucked at his boots with every step. He pushed open the barn door and stood inside. Rusty turned from the back of his stall and looked at him. "Easy," Luke said. He moved past the stall to the far wall where the tack hung in its usual order. Rusty's old saddle sat on its wooden bracket near the corner, the one place in the barn that never changed. Luke had kept it there for years, without fully knowing why. He did not ride with it anymore. The leather was too old, and the stitching in the skirt had gone stiff. But he had never thrown it away. He had oiled it twice a year, the same as the other tack, without asking himself why. He lifted the saddle off the bracket now and carried it to the center of the barn, where the morning light came in through the gap above the doors. He set it over the top rail of an empty stall and leaned in close. The dust was thick in the carved lines of the cantle. He pulled his sleeve across the fender and rubbed slowly, working toward the front of the skirt where Clara had pointed. He rubbed in slow circles the way you do when you are not entirely sure you want to see what is underneath. Then, there it was, small, no bigger than a silver dollar. A 5-pointed star burned into the leather just below the pommel, clean and deliberate, the kind of mark a man makes when he wants to be sure something comes back to him. Luke went very still. He had looked at this saddle for years and never let himself look at that mark. He had noticed it the first time he slung the saddle onto a rack, back when he was still hollow from the war and moving too fast to think. He had seen it and moved on. He had been moving on from things for a long time, but now he stood in the dim barn with his hand resting on the old leather and the mark right there under his fingers. And the memory he had kept at a distance for 15 years came forward whether he wanted it to or not. It came the way those things always come. Not gently, smoke first, then the sound. The ambush had hit them in a dry creek bed in the middle of a summer morning that had seemed no different from any other. 1 minute, there was dust and heat and the usual jangle of gear. The next minute, there were men down and horses screaming, and the whole world narrowing to noise and confusion and the desperate math of survival. Luke had gone down with his horse. The animal took a shot and fell sideways, and Luke went under, his leg pinned, the air knocked flat from his chest. He remembered staring up at a piece of pale sky between the creek bank and thinking that this was probably it, that he had used up whatever luck he had been carrying. Then hands grabbed him, strong ones. A young soldier, younger than Luke by at least 10 years, with dark eyes and a wide grin that seemed entirely wrong for the situation. He had dragged Luke out from under the dead horse by main force, talking the whole time, saying something that Luke had not been able to hear over the ringing in his ears. He had gotten Luke to his feet. He had looked him over once, fast and thorough, the way a man checks a fence line for brakes. Then he had taken the reins of his own red horse and pressed them into Luke's hands. Luke had tried to refuse. The young soldier had not let him. "Take him," he said. "I will catch another. You cannot walk out of here, and I can." Luke had looked at the horse, then back at the soldier. "What is your name?" he managed. The young man was already moving, already turning back toward the fighting with nothing but his sidearm and whatever courage a person is born with. "Bell," he called back. "Daniel Bell. You can buy me a coffee when this is done." He had disappeared into the smoke. Luke had ridden the red horse out of that creek bed. He had looked back once. Daniel Bell was gone. Luke stood in the barn now, with his hand on the silver star, and 15 years of quiet grief pressing down on his chest like a stone. Clara had walked 3 nights through rain and hunger following her mother's last instruction. She had found his barn. She had found Rusty. She had known about the star. She was Daniel Bell's daughter. Luke straightened up slowly. He looked at Rusty. The horse looked back at him with calm, dark eyes. He hung the saddle back on its bracket and walked out of the barn into the wet, gray morning, moving toward the kitchen with the kind of purpose that comes not from certainty, but from finally understanding what you are walking toward. Clara woke slowly, the way someone does when their body is not sure it is safe to be awake yet. She opened her eyes to the ceiling of the ranch kitchen, with its low, dark beams and the smell of wood smoke and something warm in a pot. For a moment, she did not move. She just looked up and breathed. Then she turned her head and found Martha Reed standing at the stove, stirring with a long wooden spoon and humming something quiet under her breath. Martha noticed without turning around. "There she is," Martha said. "Stay still. Broth is almost ready. Clara pushed herself up onto one elbow. Someone had put dry clothes on her, a loose flannel shirt far too big, and a wool blanket tucked around her legs. Her wet things were hung near the stove, and her ruined shoes sat on the hearth, stuffed with dry rags. Luke was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee he had not been drinking. He had his elbows on the table and his eyes on the window, and when Clara moved, he looked over at her without a word. She looked back at him. Martha brought the broth in a deep clay bowl, with a thick slice of bread balanced on the rim, and set it on the small side table near the cot where Clara sat. She smoothed the blanket around Clara's legs the way someone does when they have been worrying for hours and need something to do with their hands. "Eat first," Martha said. "Talking comes after." Clara ate. She ate carefully, not fast, which told Luke more about the past few days than she probably meant it to. A child who has been truly hungry does not rush food when it finally comes. She holds on to it. When the bowl was mostly empty and the bread was gone, Clara looked across at Luke again. "Did you know my papa?" she asked. The question was plain and direct, the way children ask things when they are too tired to be careful about it. Luke set down his cup. He looked at her for a moment. This small girl wrapped in a flannel shirt 3 sizes too large, with her dark hair still a little tangled and her eyes steady on his face. He had been trying to decide since he left the barn how much to say. How much truth was fair to give a child who had already carried more than most grown people could stand. But looking at her now, he understood that Clara did not need protecting from the truth. She needed someone to finally tell it to her. "I did," Luke said. Clara went very still. "He saved my life," Luke said, "during a cavalry ambush. I went down under my horse and I could not get free. Your father dragged me out with his own 2 hands. He paused. Then he gave me Rusty, so I could ride clear. Told me he would catch another horse and find me after." Clara was watching him with an expression that was not quite hope and not quite grief. Something in between. "But he did not find you," she said quietly. "No," Luke said. "He did not. I did not know what happened to him. I looked once when the smoke cleared, but he was gone." He kept his voice steady. "I thought he had died there. I carried that for a long time." Clara looked down at the empty bowl in her hands. "He made it home," she said. "Mama always said he came home slow, but he came home whole." Luke nodded once. "He was brave," he said. "And kind. The kind of man who smiles when things are bad, because he figures someone has to." He looked at her. "You would not be here if it were not for him. And neither would I." Something in Clara's face broke open then. Not loudly. She did not sob or cry out. She simply let the tears come, quiet and steady, and put her hand over her mouth, as if she was trying to hold herself together just a little longer. Martha turned away from the stove and found something very important to do near the window. Luke did not look away from Clara. When she had cried herself through the worst of it, he said quietly, "I am going to take you into town. Get things sorted proper. Make sure no one harms you." The words came out steady. But even as he said them, something tightened in his chest, because he had not made a promise to another living soul in a very long time, and he was not entirely sure he remembered how. The rain had pulled back to a thin drizzle by mid-morning. Light came through the kitchen window in gray sheets, soft and pale, the kind of light that makes everything look a little washed out. The stove crackled steadily. The smell of wood smoke and wet wool filled the room. Martha stood at the long wooden table sorting through Clara's bundle, which she had brought in from the barn, wrapped in an old feed sack. She shook each piece out carefully, checking for tears and salvageable fabric the way a practical woman does when she knows throwing something away means going without. A thin dress, a spare stocking with a hole at the heel, a folded piece of paper tucked inside what might once have been a handkerchief. Clara sat on the cot near the stove, watching. Luke was near the door, pulling on his riding jacket and thinking about the road into town. The mud would be thick after a storm like last night's. He figured 2 hours there, time enough to find Sheriff Tate and say his piece, and 2 hours back before dark. He was reaching for his hat when Clara spoke. "That saddlebag," she said. Her voice was quiet, but certain. Luke turned. Martha turned. Clara was pointing at Rusty's old saddlebag, which Martha had hung near the stove on an iron peg to dry out. It was a sorry-looking thing. The leather was dark, with rain and age, cracked along the strap, and torn along the lower seam in a long, ragged split. "Mama told me," Clara said. "She told me more than once." She looked at Luke directly. "She said never let anyone throw that saddlebag away, no matter what." Luke looked at the bag. He had not thought much about it. It was old. He had carried it so long he barely noticed it anymore, the same way a man stops noticing a scar after enough years. "She was specific about it?" he asked. "Yes, sir," Clara said. "She told me if I ever found the man with the red horse, I was to make sure he looked at that bag before he did anything else." Martha set down the dress she was holding and looked at Luke. Luke crossed the kitchen and lifted the saddlebag off the peg. He turned it over in his hands. It was heavier than it should have been for an empty bag, though not by much. He pressed the leather flat with his thumb and felt something faintly stiff inside the lower body of it, not the outer pocket, but deeper, beneath the lining. He set it on the table. "You got a small knife?" he asked Martha. She produced one from her apron pocket without a word and handed it to him handle first. Luke worked slowly. He did not want to tear anything more than the leather was already torn. He ran the blade along the inner seam at the bottom of the bag, where the lining had been stitched twice, once in the original construction, and once again in smaller, tighter stitches that did not match the rest. Careful stitches, deliberate. Someone had sewn something inside, and then sewn it shut. The inner seam gave way, and Luke reached in with 2 fingers and drew out a folded piece of paper. It was thick, the kind used for official documents, and stained with weather along one edge, where water had crept in over what must have been years. He unfolded it carefully, pressing it flat against the table. Clara stood up from the cot. The 3 of them read it together in silence. It was a legal will, signed and witnessed, naming Clara May Bell as sole heir to her father Daniel Bell's small ranch parcel outside of town, and to the Bell family boarding house on Main Street. Clara put her hand over her mouth, and her eyes filled. Luke looked up at Martha. Martha was not looking at the will anymore. She was staring at the table with a strange, tight expression on her face. "Martha," Luke said. She looked at him slowly. "That boarding house," she said. "The Bell boarding house." She paused. "That is the one being run by Miriam Voss, the preacher's wife." The rain stopped just before late morning. One moment it was still tapping against the kitchen window in thin, irregular drops. Then it simply quit, the way Texas rain sometimes does, like a door being shut. The sky stayed gray and low, but the ground outside steamed faintly in the cool air, and the road ruts were full of brown water that caught the pale light. Luke hitched the wagon while Martha packed the will inside a square of oilcloth and tied it firmly with kitchen twine. She did not trust pockets. She wrapped the bundle twice, checked the knot, and tucked it flat inside her apron. "I will keep it on me," she said when Luke glanced at it. "Safer than a saddlebag." He did not argue. Clara came out of the kitchen wearing the dry clothes Martha had found for her, a plain brown dress a size too big, cinched at the waist with a strip of cotton. Her hair had been combed and braided, and she looked like a proper child again, though her eyes still carried the careful watchfulness of someone who had learned not to trust a situation just because it felt safe. She looked at the wagon and then at Luke. "Will the sheriff believe us?" she asked. "He will look at the will," Luke said. "That is a start." It was not a full answer, and Clara seemed to know it, but she climbed up onto the wagon bench without another word. Martha settled beside her. Luke took the reins. The road into town was slow going. The wagon wheels sank into the wet ruts, and Luke kept the horse to a steady walk, not wanting to throw a wheel before they even got there. The land on either side was flat and brown, the grass pressed down from the night's rain. A hawk circled somewhere high and invisible above the cloud cover. Clara sat between Luke and Martha and said very little. She watched the road. Once, she reached down and pressed her hand against Martha's apron, right where the folded oilcloth sat underneath, as if checking that it was still there. Martha covered Clara's hand with her own and left it there. Luke watched the road ahead and turned the situation over in his mind, the way a man does when he is trying to find the simplest straight line through a problem. Show the sheriff the will. State Clara's name. Let the document speak. Sheriff Tate was a steady man. He had known Luke for going on 2 years and had never given him reason to doubt his fairness. It should be simple. The town appeared out of the flat distance, the way small frontier towns do. A cluster of low wooden buildings arranged along a single main street, a water trough, a church steeple, a general store with barrels on the porch. The mud street was quiet in the late morning. A few horses were tied along the posts. A dog slept under the general store steps. Luke guided the wagon down the main street toward the sheriff's office, which sat at the far end of the block beside the land office. They were halfway down the street when Clara went still. It was not a gradual thing. One moment, she was sitting upright, looking at the buildings. The next, she had gone completely rigid, her small hands gripping the front edge of the bench, her knuckles pale. Luke looked where she was looking. A woman had stepped out of the church onto the top step. She was well dressed in dark fabric, soft-spoken in her movements, the kind of woman who never hurried, because she never needed to. She was holding a polished wooden box with a brass latch, pressing it lightly against her side the way a person holds something they carry often. Clara slid sideways off the bench and pressed herself behind Luke's arm, making herself small. "That is her," Clara whispered. Her voice was barely sound at all. "That is the Bible box lady." She pressed closer. "She told Mama the fire took the papers. She told Mama there was nothing left." Clara's fingers gripped the back of Luke's jacket. "She lied, Mr. Luke. She lied to Mama's face." Luke kept his voice low. "Don't look at her," he said. "Look straight ahead." Clara pressed herself tighter against his arm. Her breathing was fast and shallow, the kind that comes right before tears, but she pressed her lips together and held them back. Martha leaned across and put one hand on Clara's knee. She did not say anything. She just left it there, steady and warm, and that seemed to help more than words would have. Luke drove the wagon the rest of the way down the street without looking back at the church steps. He pulled up in front of the sheriff's office, set the brake, and climbed down. He helped Clara down next. Her legs were unsteady when her feet hit the ground. "Come on," he said quietly. Inside. Sheriff Amos Tate was at his desk when they came through the door. He was a broad, gray-haired man with a careful face and slow eyes that missed very little. He had a coffee cup in one hand and a land record in the other, and he set both down when he saw Luke's expression. "Harlan," he said. Then he looked at Clara and at Martha. "What has happened?" They told him everything. Luke did the talking first, keeping it plain and in order. Clara found in the barn, her mother dead on the trail, the 3 nights walking, the message about the red horse and the silver star, Daniel Bell, the cavalry ambush, the horse given freely on a field where most men had stopped giving anything. Clara being Daniel's daughter. Martha untied the oilcloth from beneath her apron and placed the folded will flat on the sheriff's desk. Tate read it slowly. He turned it over. He held it toward the window light and studied the signature lines. He read it again. Clara sat on the wooden bench along the wall and watched him with her hands folded in her lap. She looked like a child who had learned that waiting was dangerous, but had no other choice. Finally, Tate set the document down. "The will looks real," he said. "The names match the Bell family claim I have in the old county ledger from about 9 years back." He folded his hands on top of the paper. "That is something." "It is more than something," Luke said. "It names her as heir. The property is hers." Tate looked at him with patient, careful eyes. "Luke." He said the name the way a man does when he is about to say something the other person does not want to hear. "You know I respect what you have brought me here, and I believe this child." He glanced at Clara gently. "I do, but that boarding house has been operating under Miriam Voss for going on 4 years. The woman runs the church orphan fund. She feeds half the widows in this county. The circuit judge knows her by name." "And that makes her above the law?" Martha asked. Her voice was even, but her jaw was set. "No," Tate said firmly. "It makes her harder to move without airtight proof. One document with water damage, and a child's testimony against a woman with 4 years of public record." He shook his head slowly. "A sharp lawyer tears that apart in 20 minutes. We need more. Something that proves she knew about this will and acted against it." The room went quiet. Clara looked down at her folded hands. Luke stared at the will on the desk and felt the familiar pull of the easier road. Hand the document to Tate. Let the law work at its own pace. Ride back to the Double Star, sleep in the tack room, and tell himself he had done what he could. He stood up and walked to the window. Across the street, near the corner post in front of the dry goods store, Miriam Voss stood watching the sheriff's office. She was not rushing anywhere. She was not pretending to be busy. She was simply standing there with her Bible box held against her side and a calm, small smile on her face. The smile was the worst part. It was the smile of someone who was not worried. Luke turned back to the room. "I am staying," he said. "I am not handing her off and riding away. Not until the truth is fully out in the open, where nobody can bury it." The sun was low and orange over the prairie when Luke turned the wagon back onto the ranch road. Long shadows stretched across the grass. The sky behind them was still streaked with the last colors of the day, purple and gold fading into gray. Clara sat between Luke and Martha on the wagon bench. She had not said much since leaving the sheriff's office. She just watched the land go by with tired eyes, her small hands resting in her lap, her shoulders carrying a weight that no 12-year-old should know. Martha noticed. She shifted slightly so her arm pressed warm against Clara's side. Clara did not pull away. She leaned into it just the tiniest bit, the way a child does when they are too tired to pretend they do not need comfort. Luke kept his eyes on the road and his thoughts to himself. When they pulled up to the ranch, he unhitched the horses and put them up while Martha took Clara inside. He could hear Martha through the kitchen window as he worked. Her voice was low and easy, moving from one thing to the next, the way a warm stream moves over smooth stones. Not loud, not hurried, just steady. By the time Luke came inside, Martha had a fire going and a pot of beans with salt pork bubbling on the stove. Cornbread was already cut and stacked on a cloth. Clara sat at the kitchen table wrapped in a dry quilt, her wet boots gone, her hair combed back neatly. She looked smaller here in the warm lamplight than she had in the barn the night before. But she also looked a little safer. Martha set a full bowl in front of her. "Eat all of it," Martha said, not unkindly. "And when you are done, there is more." Clara picked up the spoon. She ate slowly at first, then faster when the warmth of the food reached somewhere deep and real inside her. She cleaned the bowl. Martha filled it again without being asked. Luke sat at the far end of the table and ate his own supper quietly. Somewhere between the beans and the cornbread, Clara looked up at him. "Mr. Luke," she said. "Yeah," he said. She seemed to want to say something else, but whatever it was, she let it go. She just nodded once, and looked back at her bowl. That small nod did something to Luke's chest that he did not have a name for. After supper, Martha heated water for washing up and found a clean nightgown from her own cedar chest. It was far too big for Clara, the hem dragging and the sleeves past her fingers. But Clara held the soft fabric between her fingertips, and her eyes went bright for just a moment. "Thank you," she said. "Don't thank me," Martha said, steering her toward the back room. "Just sleep." Clara stopped in the doorway. She pressed the small folded Bible page to her chest, the one that had been tucked in her dress since her mother gave it to her on the trail. Then she went inside. Martha pulled the door nearly closed. She stood there for a moment, listening until the rustling stopped and the lamp inside went quiet. Then she turned around. Luke was still at the table, staring at his coffee cup. The cot Martha had dragged from the storeroom sat beside the stove, already made up with a blanket and a flat pillow. Martha crossed her arms. "You will sleep there tonight," she said. "Not in that tack room." Luke looked at the cot. "I am fine in the barn." "I did not ask if you were fine," Martha said. "I told you where you were sleeping." He did not argue. He knew better. Martha sat down across from him and turned the lamp wick up just enough to see his face clearly. Her eyes were steady and serious. "Luke Harlan," she said, and the way she said it left no room for escape. "God did not send that child through 3 nights of storm, alone, in the dark, half-starved and soaked to the bone, just so a grown man could sit here and hide behind old sorrow." Luke was up before the sun. He did not sleep much anyway. The cot by the stove was warm enough, and the kitchen smelled like wood smoke and dried herbs, which was better than the tack room by a fair measure. But his mind would not stay quiet. It kept circling back to Clara's face in the lamplight, to the worn Bible page she pressed to her chest before she went to sleep, to Daniel Bell's name spoken out loud for the first time in years. He pulled on his boots in the dark and went outside. The morning was cool and damp, the grass still wet from the days of rain. The sky was pale gray in the east, just beginning to soften toward pink. Luke fed the horses first, then mucked the stalls, then split wood at the block behind the kitchen. He swung the axe in a steady rhythm and did not think about anything except the grain of the wood and where the blade needed to land. That was how he got through most mornings. He was stacking the last of the split wood against the wall when the kitchen door opened and lantern light spilled out warm and yellow across the wet grass. Martha leaned into the doorway. "Breakfast is close to ready," she said. Luke nodded and set down the axe. Inside, the kitchen was alive with the smell of salt pork and fried eggs and coffee heating strong on the stove. Martha moved between the iron pan and the table with the efficiency of a woman who had fed hungry people through hard seasons her whole life. She did not waste a single step. Clara appeared in the doorway of Martha's room a few minutes later. She was wearing the same oversized nightgown, her dark hair loose and tangled from sleep. She stood very still for a moment, looking at the kitchen the way a person looks at something they are afraid to trust, like it might disappear if she stepped too close. Then she saw Luke at the table with his coffee, and her shoulders dropped just slightly. "Good morning," she said, quiet but clear. "Morning," Luke said. Martha turned from the stove and looked her over, the way a careful woman checks a bird found on the ground after a storm. Not rough about it, just thorough. "Sit down," Martha said. "There are eggs, and there is pork, and there is biscuit. And after you eat, I am going to put something proper on those scratches of yours." Clara sat. She ate everything Martha put in front of her without complaint. She had the same careful hunger Luke had noticed the night before, like she was still teaching herself it was all right to eat. While Martha cleaned and dressed the scratches on Clara's hands and one deep scrape along her left shin, she asked gentle questions. Not prying ones, just the kind that let a person talk when they were ready. What had the trail been like? How long had her mama been sick before the end? Whether anyone had helped them along the way. Clara answered slowly at first, then more freely. Her mother, Eliza Bell, had been sick for nearly 2 weeks on the road. A fever that would break and then come back. They had stopped twice at farmhouses, but had no money to offer and did not stay long. Eliza had kept walking as long as her legs held her, because she said there was not much time left, and Clara needed to reach the man with the red horse before Miriam could make more trouble with the papers. Clara said that last part plainly. The way children say hard things when the hard thing has already happened, and there is nothing left to soften. Martha wrapped her shin with a clean strip of cloth and did not rush her. It was while Luke was on his second cup of coffee that Boots came quick across the porch, and Hector, one of the younger ranch hands, pushed through the kitchen door with his hat in his hands, and a look on his face that Luke recognized. It was the look of a man who had heard something bad in town and had ridden back faster than he needed to. "Mrs. Voss has been talking," Hector said, "all over town. She is saying Mr. Luke is harboring a runaway girl and using her grief to attack a Christian charity." Luke set down his cup. He did not say anything. He did not need to. Miriam Voss had not waited a single day. She had moved against them before they had gathered so much as a second witness. The gossip Hector brought sat heavy in the kitchen for a long moment. Then Martha shooed him back to his chores, refilled the coffee, and declared that worrying indoors on a bright morning was a waste of good sunlight. That was how the three of them ended up on the back porch. It was a wide porch with a low rail and a view of the pasture, where Rusty stood near the fence post in the morning sun, his red coat still dark in patches from the rain, but drying fast. The sky had gone the kind of clean, pale blue that only comes after a hard storm scrubs everything down to bare truth. The grass sparkled. The air smelled like wet earth and cedar. Clara sat on the top step with her repaired hands folded in her lap. Martha had pulled a chair close to the door and was working on a tear in one of Luke's shirts with a needle and thread. Luke sat on the rail facing out toward the pasture, one boot up, his coffee balanced on his knee. He let the quiet settle first. He had learned that from years of work with animals. You did not crowd a frightened creature. You sat near it, let it feel your stillness, and waited until it chose to come close on its own. After a while, without looking at her directly, he said, "You do not have to tell me anything you do not want to. But if you want to talk about how you got here, I am listening." Clara watched Rusty out in the pasture for a moment. Then she started talking. She told it the way tired children tell things they have been holding too long. Not all in order. Some parts twice. Some parts in a voice so small, Luke had to stay very still to catch it. Her mama had been trying to get the boarding house back for a long time. Since before winter, she had written letters to the county office, and to the circuit judge, and to anyone she thought might help. Most letters got no answer. One letter came back with a note saying the property had been transferred legal and proper, and there was nothing to be done. Her mama had not believed that. She said there was nothing legal about what Miriam Voss had done, and she said it plain and without raising her voice, which was how Clara knew she meant it completely. They had packed what they could carry and set out in early spring. Her mama was already tired before they left, but she did not say so. She just moved slower than usual and stopped to rest more than she used to. By the second week, the fever came. Clara described it carefully. Her mama would sleep through the heat of the day under whatever shade they could find, and then walk again in the cooler hours, and then sleep again. She did not complain. She told Clara stories while they walked to keep her mind off her feet. Stories about Daniel Bell and the life they were going to have when they got their home back. Then one evening, her mama stopped walking and sat down at the side of the road and did not get up again. Clara's voice did not break. It stayed steady in the way that is sometimes harder to hear than crying. She said her mama took the last of the cornbread from the bundle and pressed it into Clara's hands, and would not take any of it back no matter how Clara argued. She tucked the torn Bible page into the front of Clara's dress, right against her skin so it would not be lost. And then she held Clara's face in both hands and said the thing Clara had been carrying ever since. She said, "If all else fails, find the man riding your papa's red horse." Clara's eyes stayed fixed on Rusty across the pasture. She said he would remember what honor costs. She said it the same way her mama had said it, not like a question, like a fact that had been true for a long time, and just needed to find the right ears. Luke did not move from the rail. The coffee had gone cold on his knee. He did not notice. Sheriff Tate rode out to the Double Star just after noon dinner. Luke had been expecting him. He had the horses already tied at the post when the sheriff's gray mare came up the road, and he was pulling on his jacket when Tate swung down from the saddle. They did not say much on the ride into town. Tate had a way of thinking out loud by not talking at all, and Luke had learned enough about the man in the past 2 days to let him do it. The road was still soft from the rain, and the horses moved at an easy walk, their hooves leaving clean prints in the mud. Martha had not been happy about staying behind. She had said so 3 times before they left. The 3rd time she said it, she was standing in the kitchen doorway with a dish towel in one hand, giving Luke the kind of look that did not require any words at all. He had told her Clara needed her more than they did, which was true, and Martha had known it was true, which was why she let them go. Clara had asked only one question before Luke rode out. "Will you look for Mama's quilt?" He had not known what she meant exactly, so she described it. Her mother had sewn it from old shirt fabric and flour sackcloth, all blues and creams, with a small cross stitched into each corner square, using red thread. She said her mama made it the winter before her papa came home from the war, and that it had been on her parents' bed as long as she could remember. Luke told her he would look. He had not promised he would find it. He had learned the difference. Voss House for Wayward Children sat on a corner lot 2 blocks from the church. It was a wide 2-story building with a fresh coat of white paint, clean shutters, and a small wooden sign above the door carved in careful letters. A window box on the lower left held 2 bunches of dried lavender tied with yellow string. It looked exactly the way Miriam Voss wanted everything to look. Sheriff Tate knocked. A girl of about 10 answered the door almost immediately, as if she had been trained to respond before a second knock was ever needed. She was neatly dressed, hair pinned back tight, and she kept her eyes on the floor between them. "Good afternoon, Sheriff," she said quietly. "Mrs. Voss is expecting you." Luke noticed she had not been told about him. Her eyes moved to his boots and then back to the floor, and she said nothing else. Miriam appeared from the hallway with a smile already in place. She wore a dark blue dress with a white collar and carried herself the way a woman carries herself when she is completely certain she is in the right place, doing the right thing. "Sheriff Tate." She clasped her hands warmly. "And Mr. Harlan. What a pleasant surprise." Nothing about her voice said it was a surprise at all. She showed them through the front rooms herself, the parlor, the dining room, the small schoolroom at the back where 2 children were bent over writing slates. Everything was neat. The floors were swept. The curtains were pressed. A Bible verse was painted above the schoolroom door in careful script. But the children were too quiet. Not the natural quiet of children focused on lessons. A different kind of quiet. The kind that comes from learning that noise brings attention, and attention is not always safe. The meals at supper were thin. Luke could see the pot simmering on the kitchen stove through the open door, and it was mostly water with a few pale vegetables floating near the top. Miriam kept talking the whole time. About the children she had helped. About the donations the church had given. About how heartbreaking it was when confused young ones were led astray by well-meaning strangers who did not understand proper care. She said that last part, looking straight at Luke. He said nothing. She showed them to the door herself, But, before they reached it, Luke glanced through the half-open door of Miriam's private sitting room. Folded across the back of the chair nearest the window was a quilt, blue and cream, shirt fabric and flower sackcloth. And at the nearest corner, just visible from the hallway, a small cross stitched in red thread. Luke looked at it for one long moment. Then he turned and followed the sheriff out the door. They walked the horses to the back of the livery stable before either of them spoke. It was a good spot. The building blocked the wind and the view from the main street, and the only sounds were the low shifting of horses inside and the occasional drip of water from the roof edge. Nobody came back here in the middle of the afternoon without a reason. Tate looped his reins over a post and pulled his hat off. He ran a hand through his gray hair and let out a long breath, the kind that carries more weight than words. "The children are scared," he said. "Yes," Luke said. "I saw it too." Tate turned his hat in his hand slowly. "The way that girl answered the door, the ones in the schoolroom, the boy near the kitchen who stepped back when I looked at him. They move like they are trying not to be noticed," Luke said. "They do." Tate was quiet for a moment. "But scared children are not proof of a crime, Luke. A judge will not issue papers because children are too quiet. Half the children in this county are too quiet. Hard times make them that way." Luke leaned against the livery wall and looked at the dirt. He understood what the sheriff was saying. He did not like it, but he understood it. "The quilt," he said. "I did not see a quilt. Sitting room, left chair by the window, blue and cream squares with red crosses at the corners. Clara described it to me this morning before we left. Said her mother made it the winter after the war." Tate put his hat back on and thought about that. Miriam would say it was donated. Clara will say different. Clara is a 12-year-old orphan girl with no living parent to back her claim, and Miriam Voss has been a fixture of this town for 11 years. Tate said it plainly, not unkindly. "A quilt is not enough either. I need something I can take before the circuit judge and have it hold up without falling apart the moment Miriam smiles at the jury." Luke did not argue. He pushed off the wall and picked up his reins. The afternoon was getting on, and he wanted to be back at the ranch before Clara had too long to sit alone with her worries. "Then we find something that holds up," he said. Tate nodded slowly. "We do it right, or we do not do it at all. You rush this, and Miriam walks free and Clara loses everything." He mounted his mare with the careful movement of a man whose knees had been protesting the saddle for several years. "I am going to look at property records this evening, quietly. There may be more to see there than what is obvious on the surface." They rode back separately, Tate turning toward the courthouse block, and Luke heading out the north road toward the ranch. The sun was sitting low and orange over the pasture when Luke came up the drive. Clara was on the back porch with Martha, snapping dried beans into a tin bowl. She looked up when she heard the horse, and something in her face relaxed just slightly, the way a person breathes easier when someone they were waiting for finally comes through the door. Luke unsaddled and came around to the porch. He sat on the top step and told them what the boarding house had looked like. He kept his voice even and did not use words that would frighten her more than she already was. Then he described the children he had seen, the quiet ones, the careful ones. He mentioned the boy near the kitchen who had stepped back when the sheriff looked his way, small, thin, wearing boots that seemed too large for his feet. Clara set down her handful of beans. "Was he little?" she asked. "Dark hair? A sort of crooked front tooth?" "Could be," Luke said. "I did not get a close look." "That sounds like Toby," Clara said. "Mama knew his family." She paused. "His papa and mama both died 2 winters ago. They had land out by the creek." She looked at Luke steadily. "Mama said Mrs. Voss took Toby in right after. Said it was Christian charity." Clara's voice was quiet but certain. "But Mama also said the creek land went with Mrs. Voss not long after that." The record room behind the courthouse smelled like old paper and damp wood. It was a narrow space, barely wider than a hallway, with shelves running floor to ceiling on both sides and a single window set high in the back wall that let in a thin strip of pale morning light. 2 oil lamps burned on the work table because the window was not enough. The table itself was buried under stacks of ledgers, bound folders, and loose papers tied with string that had gone brittle with age. Sheriff Tate was already there when Luke arrived. He had his coat on, his hat set aside, and 3 large ledgers open in front of him. He did not look up right away. "Close the door," he said. Luke did. He pulled a stool to the far end of the table and looked at the nearest pile. The papers were dry and yellowed at the edges. Some of the ink had faded to a pale brown that was hard to read without leaning close. "What are we looking at?" Luke asked. "Guardianship filings going back 12 years. Tate pointed to the leftmost ledger. "Every child placed under a legal guardian in this county had to be registered here. Names, ages, property listed at time of placement." He slid a second ledger toward Luke. "That one is probate. Wills and estate settlements. Cross-check any child who appears in the guardianship book against this one and see whether their family left anything behind." Luke opened the probate ledger and began reading. It was slow work. The handwriting changed from year to year, depending on which clerk had been on duty, and some of the entries were cramped and hard to follow. But the names were clear enough. He worked through them one by one, running his finger down each column, and then flipping to the corresponding guardianship record. For the first hour, most of what he found was ordinary. Children placed with aunts or uncles. Small estates passed to surviving relatives. The normal sadness of families worn down by sickness and bad seasons. Then he found the first one, a boy named Henry Pruitt, 8 years old at the time of filing. Father died of fever. Mother died 6 weeks later. The probate entry showed a modest savings account held at the county land office and a quarter section of grazing land on the South Fork. The guardianship record showed placement with Voss House for wayward children, with Miriam Voss listed as guardian. Luke checked the follow-up entry for the land. It had been transferred 14 months later. The listed reason was unpaid tax debt settled by guardian on behalf of minor ward. The land went to a holding account that had Miriam's name attached to it as administrator. He set his finger on the entry and looked at Tate. Tate came around the table and read it without speaking. Then he went back to his ledger. "Keep going," he said. Luke kept going. By mid-morning they had found 4 more names. A girl named Pearl, whose family had owned a small dry goods account, that disappeared inside Miriam's charity fund 8 months after her placement. 2 brothers, ages 6 and 9, whose father had left a paid-off mule lot that transferred to a church property deed within a year of their arrival at Voss House. A girl of 10, whose mother had left a written will specifying the family's garden plot go to the daughter when she came of age. The will was referenced in the probate index, but the original document was listed as missing. Missing. That word appeared more than once. Luke started marking those entries with a small notch of his thumbnail against the page edge so he could find them again. By noon, they had 7 names laid out in a rough line across the table, each one tied to a lost deed, a vanished will, or a property transfer that moved in one direction only, toward Miriam. Tate stood back from the table with his arms crossed and looked at what they had built. "It is a pattern," he said, "clear enough that anyone with eyes can see it." He paused. "But every original document is gone. What we have is the shadow of what happened, not the thing itself." He looked at Luke. "We need one public mistake from her, or we need to find wherever she is keeping the originals. Without that, a good lawyer turns this into coincidence, and we lose Clara in the courtroom." The afternoon sun sat low and heavy over the Double Star Ranch when Luke rode back through the gate. He was dusty from the road and tired in the kind of way that sleep could not fix. The record room had left something behind in his chest. Not hopelessness exactly. More like the weight of seeing clearly what he had only suspected before. 7 children. 7 families. 7 quiet thefts wrapped in charitable language and soft smiles. He unsaddled the borrowed horse slowly, taking his time, letting the familiar work settle his hands, even if it could not settle his mind. When he came around the side of the barn, he stopped. Clara was in the small paddock beside Rusty's stall, a soft brush moving slow and steady along the old horse's flank. Martha sat on the fence rail a few feet away, with her arms folded, watching. Rusty stood with his head low and his eyes half closed, still as a painted picture. He was not a horse that tolerated fussing easily. Luke had seen Rusty sidestep and snort at ranch hands who had known him for years. But under Clara's hand, the old red horse stood like he was planted in the ground. Martha noticed Luke first. She gave him a look that asked the question she would not ask in front of Clara. Luke shook his head once, just slightly. Not yet. Martha nodded and looked back at Clara. You have a good touch with him, Martha said to the girl. Clara drew the brush along Rusty's shoulder in a long, careful stroke. He lets me, she said simply. He didn't used to let me touch him before, but that was a long time ago. Mama said Papa rode him before Mr. Luke did. She looked at the horse's neck with a quietness that was older than 12 years. Maybe he remembers. Luke leaned against the paddock fence beside Martha and watched without speaking for a moment. Rusty turned his big head slowly and looked at Luke with one dark eye. Then he turned back toward Clara. Luke almost smiled at that. After a while, Clara noticed him standing there. She did not startle. She just looked at him the way she had started doing, open and steady, like she was trying to read what he was not saying. "Did you find anything?" she asked. "Some," Luke said. "The sheriff is still working on it. Nothing for you to worry on tonight." It was not a lie exactly. It was the truth arranged carefully, the way you might arrange a fence to keep a small animal from the part of the pasture that was not safe yet. Clara accepted it and went back to brushing. After supper, when the dishes were done and the ranch hands had gone back to the bunkhouse, and Martha was knitting near the lamp, Luke sat on the back porch step, and Clara came and sat beside him. The evening was still and cool. The sky was going to dark blue above the tree line. Clara had her mother's Bible page folded in her hand, the way she always did in the evenings, just holding it. "Will you tell me more about my papa?" she asked. Luke looked out at the pasture where Rusty had been turned loose for the evening. The horse was a dark red shape, moving slowly against the pale grass. "He couldn't sing," Luke said. Clara looked at him. Not even a little. "He tried every campfire we ever shared." Luke shook his head slowly. Drove the whole troop near to madness. But he never stopped trying. Said singing was a man's right, whether God gave him the voice for it or not. Clara laughed. It was a small laugh, surprised out of her. The first real one Luke had heard from her. He kept going, because that laugh felt like something worth protecting. He used to talk about a place he wanted to build someday, a boarding house. Said no traveler should go to sleep hungry if there was a roof nearby. Said children especially ought to always be able to find a warm meal and a dry floor. Luke paused. He talked about it like it was already real, like he just had to get home first and then start building. Clara was quiet for a moment. Her hand tightened slightly around the Bible page. "He got home," she said softly. "He married Mama, and they had me, and they were building it. Before he died, they were already building it." Luke did not answer right away. The knowing of that sat heavy and tender at the same time. "He saved my life," Luke said. "Pulled me off the ground when I couldn't get up. Gave me Rusty when he had every reason to keep him." He looked at his own hands. "I spent a long time thinking he saved the wrong man. That a better man died, so a worn-out one could keep going. Clara turned and looked at him with her mother's steady eyes. "Papa gave you his horse," she said. "He didn't give things away by accident." She looked back out at the pasture where Rusty grazed in the fading light. "He must have wanted you to live, Mr. Luke, else he would not have given you Rusty." The words were simple. They were the simplest words Luke had heard in years. And something in his chest, that had been pulled tight for a very long time, went quiet. Morning came clear and bright, the kind of morning that felt like the sky was trying to make up for the storm. Light came through the kitchen windows in long gold strips and laid itself across the table where Clara sat eating oatmeal. She had not said much since waking. She ate carefully, her eyes moving to the window every so often, watching the road. Martha noticed. Martha always noticed. She set down her coffee cup and looked at Clara for a long moment. Then she looked at the window. Then she made a small sound in her throat that meant she had decided something. "Finish your breakfast," she said. "Then come with me." Clara looked up. "Where are we going?" "Nowhere yet." Martha was already moving toward the back room. "But you are not walking into that town looking like you crawled out of a ditch." Clara glanced at Luke across the table. Luke kept his eyes on his coffee. He had learned in the past several days that when Martha made that particular sound, the wisest thing a person could do was stay out of the way. Martha came back carrying a dress folded over her arm. It was blue. A quiet, clean blue, the color of sky after rain. She spread it across the table beside Clara's bowl and studied it with the careful eye of a woman who had sewn and mended and altered her way through more years than she cared to count. "This was mine," Martha said. "Too small in the shoulder for me now anyway." She held a length of it up beside Clara's arm. "We'll take the hem up and bring the waist in, and you'll look like exactly what you are." "What am I?" Clara asked quietly. Martha looked at her directly. "Daniel Bell's daughter, going into town to claim what belongs to her." Clara stared at the dress. Something moved across her face. Something soft and scared and grateful all at once. Then she nodded. They worked at the kitchen table while Luke finished his coffee and went out to the barn. Martha had scissors and a needle threaded before the morning was half done. Clara sat on the stool beside her and held the hem in place, while Martha pinned and cut and stitched with the practiced speed of a woman who had clothed a household on her own for many years. Luke, meanwhile, found something to do with his hands. He pulled his good boots from the bottom of his saddlebag. He had not worn them since the last time someone had died, and the whole town had shown up to stand in the churchyard. He sat outside the barn door in the sun and cleaned them with a rag and oil until the leather showed its proper color again. Then he set them aside and got the brush from the tack room. Rusty watched him come with the brush and stood without being tied, which was as close to cooperation as the old horse usually offered. Luke worked over the red coat in long, steady strokes until the dust was gone and the color showed true beneath the morning sun. Rusty's coat caught the light and held it, a deep, warm red like autumn clay, with the white blaze on his nose bright as fresh paint. Luke brushed out the mane and the tail and stood back and looked at the horse for a moment. Rusty turned his head and looked back. "You remember this," Luke said quietly. It was not a question. Then he went inside to wrap the will in its oilcloth, fold it flat, and tuck it carefully inside his vest where it would not shift or fall. By the time the wagon was hitched and the afternoon was tilting toward gold, Clara came out of the house in the blue dress. It fit her well. Martha had done the kind of work that looked simple, because it was done right. The hem was straight, and the waist was neat, and Clara stood in the yard with her hands folded and her chin up, trying her best to look unafraid. She did not quite manage it, but she was trying. Luke climbed up onto the wagon seat and held out his hand to help her up. Martha settled in on the other side, and Clara sat between them with the Bible page tucked in her pocket. The wagon moved out through the ranch gate and onto the road, and the late afternoon light lay warm and flat across the prairie grass on both sides. Clara was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "What if my voice shakes?" Luke looked straight ahead at the road. The muscles in his jaw moved once. "Then it shakes," he said, "but mine will stand steady right beside it." The church social was already going strong when the wagon rolled up. Long tables stretched across the yard, loaded with pies and jars of preserves and plates of cornbread. Children chased each other near the front steps. Women in their good dresses stood in small clusters, laughing and trading news. Men leaned against fence posts with their hats pushed back, talking the slow, easy talk of people who had nowhere urgent to be. And at the center of all of it stood Miriam Voss. She wore a pale gray dress with a white collar, and her hair was pinned up neat beneath a modest bonnet. She moved between people with a warm hand on every arm, a kind word for every face. She laughed at something an older man said. She crouched to adjust a small boy's collar. She accepted a jar of honey from a woman with a baby on her hip and pressed the woman's hand with both of hers, like the gift was the most generous thing she had ever received. Clara saw her from the wagon seat and went very still. Luke felt the girl's shoulder press against his arm. He did not say anything. He just reached across and gave her hand one short, firm squeeze. Martha climbed down from the wagon first. She moved with the calm authority of a woman who had been feeding and managing people her whole life, and was not afraid of a churchyard full of them. Sheriff Tate was already waiting near the fence post. He had arrived ahead of them, as they had planned. He gave Luke a small nod. Luke tied Rusty to the fence near the gate. The red horse stood out against the white painted pickets, like a flame set in a white wall. Several people glanced over. One older man tilted his head at the horse, the way a person does when something stirs a memory they cannot quite reach. Luke helped Clara down from the wagon. She stood on the ground in her blue dress and looked at the yard full of people. Her hands were folded in front of her. Her chin was up. She looked very small and very brave. "Ready?" Luke asked. "No," she said honestly. "But yes." They walked in together. A few people noticed them and fell quiet. Then a few more. The quiet spread slowly outward through the crowd the way a stone dropped in still water sends its rings to every edge. Miriam Voss turned. Her expression did not change. Not her eyes. Not the line of her mouth. She simply looked at Luke and Clara with the same soft, composed smile she wore for everyone, and something cold and careful lived behind it. Luke did not look away from her. He stopped in the middle of the yard where most of the town could hear, and he spoke in a voice that was not loud but was clear. "Folks," he said, "I am sorry to interrupt. I have something that needs to be said in front of all of you." The yard went quiet. Luke told them about Daniel Bell. He kept it plain and honest. He told them about the cavalry ambush, about a young soldier who dragged him from the killing ground and put him on a red horse and sent him toward life. He told them that soldier's name was Daniel Bell, and that Daniel had built a boarding house near this very town, and that Daniel's daughter had walked 3 nights through a prairie storm to find the horse her father once owned, because her mother told her there was a man with that horse who would remember what honor cost. Several of the older veterans near the back of the crowd had stopped talking. One of them took off his hat. Clara stood beside Luke, with her hands folded and her eyes straight ahead. Her chin did not drop. Luke reached into his vest and took out the folded oilcloth. He unwrapped it carefully, smoothing the will open with both hands. "Mrs. Voss," he said. He looked directly at Miriam. "You have always said your heart is for orphaned children. This is Clara Maybell's legal will, naming her heir to her family's property." He held it out toward her. "Would you read it aloud for us?" The crowd leaned in. Miriam's eyes moved from Luke to Clara to the document. For just a moment, something shifted behind her smile, something tight and calculating. Then she took the paper. She looked down at it. Her lips moved slightly, reading silently first. Then she looked up at the crowd with her eyes full of tears and her voice barely above a whisper. "I cannot," she said. People stirred. Someone said, "What is it, Miriam?" She pressed the paper back toward Luke, her hand trembling visibly. "I cannot read this because I do not know who wrote it." Her voice broke perfectly. "This is not what I remember from the Bell family papers. This is not Eliza Bell's hand." A murmur ran through the crowd. "She is a confused, grieving child," Miriam said gently, glancing at Clara with an expression that looked almost like pity. "And this man is a stranger who showed up with her in the night." Luke kept his voice steady. "Mrs. Voss, the silver star on that saddle matches Daniel Bell's cavalry record. Clara identified it before I ever told her it was there." But Miriam had already turned to Reverend Voss beside her. She touched his arm. Something passed between them. The Reverend cleared his throat and reached inside his coat. He produced a folded document of his own. It was older looking, yellowed at the edges, tied with a thin strip of ribbon. "Eliza Bell signed this before she passed," he said quietly. "She transferred the boarding house to the care of our ministry. We have the original paperwork." The crowd went uncertain. Luke could feel it, the way the silence changed, the way people looked at each other instead of at Clara, the way a few of the women near the pie tables leaned together and whispered. One of the veterans had put his hat back on. Clara stood very still beside Luke, and he could feel the slight tremor moving through her shoulder. Sheriff Tate stepped forward before anyone else could speak. He held out his hand toward Reverend Voss without ceremony. "I will take that." The Reverend hesitated. His eyes moved to Miriam. She gave the smallest nod, and he placed the document in the sheriff's hand. Tate took Luke's will next. He held both papers side by side, not reading them aloud, just looking. His face was the same steady face he wore at every town meeting and every courthouse step. Nothing in it gave anything away. Miriam watched him. Then she turned back to the crowd. "I do not wish to make this ugly," she said softly. Her voice was the kind of voice that made people lean in to hear it, gentle and sorrowful, like a woman carrying a burden she never asked for. "That little girl has suffered. Anyone can see it. She lost her mother. She walked alone in a storm. My heart breaks for her." Several women in the crowd nodded. "But suffering does not make a story true," Miriam continued. "And a child in pain can be led to believe almost anything by a person who wants something from her." Luke felt the words land on him, like stones dropped from a height. A man near the fence post crossed his arms. A woman in a yellow bonnet looked at Luke with narrow eyes. These were not bad people. He knew that. They were simply people who had known Miriam Voss for years and had known Luke Harlan for almost no time at all. "This man has no family here," Miriam said, and her tone stayed soft, never unkind, which made it worse somehow. "No church home, no property. He drifts from ranch to ranch. He has spoken before about the war in ways that concerned people who know him." She paused. "I am not saying he is wicked. I am saying a damaged man and a grieving child are a painful combination, and the law should settle this quietly before anyone else is hurt." Luke did not move. He stood with his boots planted in the churchyard dirt, and he looked straight at Miriam Voss, and he let the words wash past him the way cold rain washes past a fence post. He had heard worse. He had thought worse about himself on dark nights in the tack room. But he felt Clara shift beside him, and that mattered more than his own pride. He looked down at her. Clara was watching Miriam. Her face was calm in the way a person's face goes calm when they are working very hard not to fall apart. Her hands were still folded in front of her blue dress, and her chin was still up, but her knuckles had gone white. Martha stepped quietly to Clara's other side. She did not make a speech. She did not raise her voice. She simply stood there, solid as a fence post herself, close enough that Clara's arm pressed against hers. Sheriff Tate folded both documents carefully and tucked them inside his coat. He looked at Miriam. Then, he looked at the crowd. "These papers will be examined properly," he said. "The circuit judge arrives in 2 days. Until that review is complete, this child stays where she is safe." Miriam's expression did not change, but something behind her eyes sharpened. Surely the church can provide more suitable care than a ranch hand's kitchen. "The child stays where she is," Tate said. His voice was not loud, but it had the flat, final quality of a door closing. "That is not open for discussion, Mrs. Voss." The crowd went very quiet. Miriam pressed her lips together and lowered her eyes, the picture of patient dignity. Reverend Voss stared at the ground beside her. Nobody spoke. After a long moment, people began drifting back toward the pie tables, not with the easy chatter of before, but with the uncomfortable shuffle of a crowd that had witnessed something they were not yet sure how to name. Luke touched Clara's shoulder. "Time to go," he said quietly. They walked back to the wagon in the long gold light of early dusk, and the red horse followed them with his ears up. The ranch was quiet by the time they got back. The horses were still. The sky had cleared after the storm, and the stars were thick and cold above the dark prairie. Martha lit the kitchen lamp and set water on the stove without being asked. Luke tied Rusty in his stall, checked the latch twice, and stood in the barn doorway listening to the night before he came inside. Nobody talked much over supper. Martha made biscuits and warmed the last of the bean pot. Clara ate slowly, her eyes on her plate, the blue dress now wrinkled from the long ride home. Luke ate standing near the window because sitting still felt wrong. After supper, Martha took the will from Luke's coat pocket. She smoothed it carefully on the kitchen table, then wrapped it again in the oilcloth, then wrapped that in a dish towel, and carried it to the pantry. Luke followed her with the lamp. In the back corner of the pantry, behind the dried beans and the extra flour sacks, sat a tin box with a small iron lock. Martha pressed the will inside, closed the lid, and turned the key. She tucked the key into the pocket of her apron. "Nobody gets in without that key," she said. Luke looked at the tin. He looked at the pantry door. Then he went outside and checked the barn again. He walked the perimeter of the ranch yard too, slow and quiet, the way he used to walk the edge of a cavalry camp before dawn. The fence posts were solid. The gate was latched. The kitchen door locked from inside. He came back in, pulled off his boots, and lay down on the cot by the stove that Martha had made up with a folded quilt. He did not sleep. He stared at the ceiling and listened to the small sounds of the house settling, the creak of the floorboards in Martha's room, the low breathing of the horses from the barn, the distant call of something moving out on the dark prairie. Every sound made him open his eyes. Every silence did the same. Down the hall, Clara was not sleeping either. She lay in Martha's spare bed with the quilt pulled to her chin and her mother's Bible page pressed against her palm. The lamp was out, but enough moonlight came through the window curtain to see the shapes of things. She stared at the ceiling the same way Luke was doing in the next room, though neither one knew it about the other. She kept seeing Miriam's face at the social. That soft voice, that careful sorrow that was not sorrow at all. And then she kept seeing the crowd, the way they shifted, the way their eyes moved from Miriam to Luke, and then away from Clara. She thought about the sheriff's careful words. 2 days. The circuit judge. She thought about Luke, standing in the churchyard with his boots planted and his jaw set, while Miriam's words tried to cut him down. He had stayed because of her. Martha had stayed because of her. And all they had gotten for it so far was a reputation built on suspicion and a town full of doubt. Clara pressed her eyes shut. She did not hear the sound at first. It was soft. A small scrape near the back of the house, the kind of sound a branch makes when it drags against wood. She might have let it go, but then it came again. A creak. Then a longer silence. Then the faint, sharp sound of metal working against metal. She sat up. The house was dark. She listened hard, her heart knocking against her ribs. There was a soft pop from the direction of the pantry, like something giving way. Then nothing. Clara did not breathe for a long time. She waited. The silence stretched out and went still, and she knew the way you know things in your bones that it was already done. She climbed out of the bed. She did not wake Martha. She went to the small writing table in the corner and found a pencil and a scrap of paper, and she sat down in the moonlight. Her hand shook while she wrote. She told Luke she was sorry. She told him she never meant to bring harm to people who had only been kind. She told him Rusty was her papa's horse, and she knew the way. She folded the note and set it on the pillow. Then she went to the barn. Rusty was awake. He turned when she pushed open the stall door, his dark eyes catching the thin moonlight. Clara pressed her face against his neck and did not cry. She had cried enough. She just stood there a moment, breathing him in, warm and real and steady. Then she reached up, and he lowered his head for her. The gray light of sunrise was just beginning to push through the kitchen window when Martha's cry cut through the stillness of the house. It was not a scream. Martha was not a woman who screamed. It was a sharp, startled sound, the kind that comes when something you trusted has been broken. It came from the pantry. Luke was off the cot before the sound finished. He crossed the kitchen in his socked feet, shoulder catching the doorframe as he turned into the pantry. Martha stood with the flour tin in both hands. The lid was open. The lock had been forced. The small iron latch bent back ugly. Inside the tin, the dish towel was still there, folded neatly the way Martha had placed it. But the oilcloth and the will were gone. Martha looked at Luke. Her face was pale and tight and older than it usually looked in the mornings. "It was here," she said. "I locked it myself." Luke took the tin from her and turned it over in his hands. The latch had been worked with something thin and sharp. Done quietly, done carefully. This was not somebody who stumbled into a ranch kitchen. This was somebody who knew exactly what they were looking for and exactly where to find it. He set the tin down on the flour sack and walked back into the kitchen. He looked at the back door. The lock was still turned from the inside, but the lower window beside it was unlatched. The gap was narrow. Not wide enough for a grown man, maybe, but wide enough for someone patient and thin. He stood there a moment, with his jaw tight. Then he thought of Clara. He turned fast and went down the short hall to Martha's room. He pushed the door open without knocking. The bed was made. Not rumpled, not slept in hard, but smoothed over with the kind of careful tidying a child does when she is trying not to leave a mess behind. The quilt was folded across the foot of the bed. The Bible page was gone from the pillow. And there was a note. It was folded once and set square in the middle of the pillow, like she had thought about placing it just right. Luke picked it up. His hands were steady, but his chest was not. He read it standing there in the gray morning light coming through the curtain. She had written in small, careful letters. She was sorry, she said. She was sorry for the trouble she had brought. She was sorry that Miriam had come in the night and taken the proof, and that now there was nothing left but her word against a woman the whole town loved. She said she did not want to watch Luke lose any more on her account. She said she knew where her papa's boarding house was from her mother's stories, and she thought she might find something there that could still help. And she said she was not afraid. That last line was the worst one. Luke folded the note once and held it. He had stood on a battlefield in the smoke and the screaming, and he had looked around at the men who were not moving anymore, and he had felt exactly this, the particular cold terror of being too late, of arriving at the place where something important had just slipped past saving. He had spent years with that feeling living in the back of his chest. He thought he knew it by now. He thought maybe he had made some kind of peace with it. He had not. He put the note in his shirt pocket and walked back to the kitchen. Martha was already there, her shawl pulled tight, her face reading him. "She's gone," Luke said. "She took Rusty." Martha closed her eyes for just 1 second. Then she opened them and she moved. She went to the back door and pulled it wide and called out across the ranch yard, in a voice that carried hard across the still morning air. Ranch hands appeared from the bunkhouse. Neighbors from the near pasture looked up. Martha pointed them in directions and told them in plain words what to do. Luke went to the barn and saddled the nearest horse with hands that did not waste a single motion. He was riding before the sun had fully cleared the horizon. The road to town was empty in the early morning. Rusty moved steady beneath Clara, his big hooves leaving clean prints in the mud the storm had left behind. She kept him at a walk, where the road dipped low and soft, then nudged him to a trot on the harder ground. He obeyed without fussing. He always did for her, and she was still not used to that. The way he seemed to know her. She kept one hand on his neck. It helped. The countryside around her was quiet and washed clean by last night's rain. Birds called from the fence posts. The grass along the road edges was dark green and heavy with water. It was the kind of morning that should have felt peaceful, and it did not. Clara kept her eyes moving. She watched the road behind her twice, then 3 times, then made herself stop looking and think instead. Her mother had told her stories about the boarding house, the way other mothers told bedtime stories. Not fairy tales, real ones. The smell of the kitchen in the mornings, the creak of the second porch step, the way her papa had built the cellar himself with a neighbor and 2 borrowed shovels, and how her mama had swept it clean and lined the shelves with preserves and wrapped bread. Her mama had laughed telling that part. She said the shelves were so even and straight, it looked like her papa had measured them with his hat brim. And her mama had said something else. Once, when Clara was small enough to sit in her lap, Eliza Bell had spoken quietly about what she called her hiding places. She had said that if you love something, you find it a home inside a home. She had showed Clara the little cross she embroidered into the corner of every quilt she made. Her mark, her way of saying, "I was here." Clara had not understood then. She understood now. The boarding house came into view before she expected it. It sat back from the main road on a short rise, a 2-story building with a wide porch and a fence that had lost half its boards. Miriam had moved the charity children into the newer building closer to the church. This place had been standing empty long enough to look like it was trying to remember something. Clara slowed Rusty and studied it. No horses outside, no movement at the windows. The front door was boarded, but the side door near the old kitchen garden was only latched. She tied Rusty to the fence post, pressed her hand flat against his cheek for a moment, and then walked to the side door. The latch lifted easy. Inside smelled like dust and old wood, and something faint and sweet she could not name. She found the cellar door in the back hall, right where her mother had described it. The iron ring handle was cold and stiff. She pulled it up, and it opened with a groan that seemed very loud in the empty house. The cellar was darker than the hall, but light came through a narrow ground-level window near the far wall, enough to see by. Shelves lined both sides, empty now except for a few old jars. The floor was hard-packed dirt. The ceiling was low. Clara moved to the far wall where the old stone foundation ran, and she started looking. Her mother had said the brick, the loose one, the one marked with her cross. Clara ran her fingers along the mortar lines, pressing gently, until one brick shifted. Just slightly, just enough. She worked it out carefully, both hands, the way you handle something that matters. Behind it was a small space, no bigger than a bread tin. Inside that space was a bundle of folded papers tied with kitchen string that had gone brittle with age. Clara's hands were shaking when she pulled them out. She untied the string slowly. The papers were letters, her mother's handwriting, letters addressed to Miriam Voss, letters asking, then pleading, then begging for the return of the Bell family papers. Her mother had hidden them here. She had known. She had planned ahead, even when she had nothing left. Clara pressed the letters against her chest. Then a shadow fell across the cellar steps, and Miriam Voss stood at the cellar door, the stolen will folded in her hand, looking down at Clara with an expression that was almost calm. Miriam came down the cellar steps one at a time. Slow, deliberate, the way a person moves when they are not afraid of anything. She was dressed neatly, as always. Her dark skirt was barely muddy at the hem. Her hair was pinned without a strand out of place. She carried the stolen will flat against her palm like it was a hymnal, and she looked at Clara the way a school teacher looks at a child who has written the wrong answer on a slate. "Clara May," she said. Her voice was soft, almost tender. "You are going to hurt yourself, running around like this." Clara stepped back until her shoulders touched the stone wall. She pulled her mother's letters tighter against her chest. Miriam's eyes dropped to the letters. Something moved across her face. Not anger. Not exactly. Something colder than anger. "Where did you find those?" she asked. Clara did not answer. Miriam tilted her head a little. "It does not matter. You should not have come here alone, sweetheart. Old buildings are dangerous, cellars especially." She took another step down. "You could have gotten hurt." "You took our papers," Clara said. Her voice came out smaller than she wanted. "You told my mama the fire took them. But you had them. You always had them." Miriam smiled. It was the kind of smile that had fooled a whole town, gentle at the edges, warm in the way a painted window looks warm until you touch the cold glass. "Your mama was a good woman," Miriam said, "but she was not practical. She was sick. She was struggling. What was she going to do with a boarding house she could not run and a parcel of land she could not work?" She spread her hands open, like she was explaining something obvious to someone very young. "I kept the property going. I kept children fed. I did what your mama could not." "It was not yours to keep," Clara said. Miriam's smile did not change, but her eyes did. "Children are safest," she said, still in that soft, patient voice, "when they stop asking questions and let wiser adults decide their lives." She held out her hand. "Give me those letters, Clara." "No." The word was small, but it did not shake. Miriam moved fast, faster than Clara expected. She crossed the last 2 steps, and before Clara could twist away, Miriam's hand closed around the letters and pulled hard. Clara held on for one terrible second, and then the string snapped and the papers were gone. Clara reached for them. Miriam stepped back. "You will thank me one day," Miriam said, tucking the letters into her coat, "when you are older, and you understand how the world actually works." She climbed the cellar steps without hurrying. At the top, she gripped the iron ring and pulled the door down. Clara heard the bolt slide home from the outside. The thin light from the ground-level window was all that was left. Clara stood in the near dark and breathed. Then, she did the only thing she could think to do. She went to the ground-level window and pressed her face close to the dirty glass. "Rusty!" she called out. "Rusty!" She could see his legs near the fence post where she had tied him. He had already turned his head toward the building. His ears were forward. "Rusty! Here! Come here!" She did not know if a horse could understand what she needed. She only knew that he had not left her yet. He started stomping first. One hoof, then the other, a slow pound against the wet ground that got harder and louder. Then he pulled at the rope until the fence post wobbled, and he let out a whinny that split the quiet morning wide open. He struck at the outside of the cellar door with one front hoof. Then again. The whole door shuddered with it. He did not stop. He screamed and stomped and threw his head and struck the door until the sound carried across the road and into the neighboring yards. It was not long before Clara heard voices outside. Confused voices. Then running steps. Then one voice, low and ragged, and soaked through with fear and relief all at once. "Clara!" The bolt cracked. The door burst open. Gray morning light flooded in, and Luke dropped to his knees at the top of the steps, and pulled Clara up and into his arms so fast her feet left the ground. He held her the way someone holds a thing they thought was lost. His hands were shaking. He was soaked to the bone, muddy from riding hard, and he pressed one hand against the back of her head and just held on. Clara grabbed 2 fistfuls of his wet coat and did not let go. After a long moment, Luke lifted his head. Miriam was already across the yard, walking fast toward the road. The letters and the will clutched against her coat, heading in the direction of the church. Luke set Clara gently on her feet. He looked at her face to make sure she was whole. Then, he looked up at Miriam's retreating back. "Mrs. Voss!" he called out. Miriam did not stop. Luke's voice did not rise. It did not shake. It carried the way a voice carries when it has finally found the thing it was always meant to say. "That girl is my promise now." Martha arrived at the boarding-house yard before the neighbors had even stopped talking. Luke did not know how she had found them so fast. He suspected she had followed the ranch hands who were searching the creek road, and simply refused to turn back when they told her to. That was Martha. She did not ask permission to do what needed doing. She came down from the wagon seat before it had fully stopped, crossed the yard in 3 long strides, and wrapped both arms around Clara without saying a single word. Clara buried her face against Martha's shoulder and finally let herself cry. Not the quiet, careful crying she had been doing for days. Real crying. The kind that shakes a person all the way through. Luke watched them for a moment. Then he turned away so Clara would not see his own face. One of the ranch hands, a broad-shouldered man named Pete, who had worked the Double Star for years, stepped up beside Luke and spoke low. "Sheriff Tate is coming up the road. Saw him from the ridge." Luke nodded. He checked that Rusty was calmed and tied securely, then crouched down in front of Clara. Martha loosened her hold just enough so the girl could see his face. "I need you to go with Martha," Luke said. "Pete and the others will keep you safe. I have to ride with the sheriff." Clara wiped her face with the back of her hand. Her eyes were red but steady. "She took the letters," Clara said. "And the will. She had everything." "I know." "She is going to the church." "I know that too." Luke put one hand briefly on her shoulder. "That is exactly where we are going." Clara looked at him for a moment. Then she gave a small, serious nod, like someone much older than 12. Luke stood and walked to meet Sheriff Tate at the yard gate. The sheriff pulled his horse up and looked from Luke to the boarding-house cellar and back again. He had clearly been riding hard. His coat was splattered with mud all the way to his collar. "She locked the girl in the cellar," Luke said. "It was not a question. Pete told me on the road." The sheriff's jaw was tight. "How is she?" "Scared. Unhurt. Clara found letters her mother hid down there. Eliza Bell wrote to Miriam asking for the papers back. Miriam took those letters just now, along with the will we recovered." The sheriff let out a slow breath through his nose. "Then we have the testimony of a 12-year-old girl, and no physical documents." "Unless you find the problem with that transfer paper," Luke said. Sheriff Tate looked at him. "That is why I came this way. I need you to ride with me to the record room before we go anywhere near that church." They rode hard, and did not talk much. The road back to town was still soft from the rain, and the horses threw up dark clumps of mud with every stride. Luke kept his eyes forward and his mind on what needed doing. He had learned a long time ago, in harder country than this, that thinking too far ahead of the next step was how a man got himself killed, or got someone else killed. The record room behind the courthouse was a narrow, low-ceilinged space that smelled of old paper and lamp oil. The county clerk, a thin young man named Orrin, who wore his sleeves too long, unlocked the door for the sheriff without argument. He had learned not to argue with Sheriff Tate, when the sheriff had that particular look on his face. Tate went straight to the bound ledger for county office transactions and filings. He had already been through the general guardianship records the day before. Today, he wanted one specific week. The week printed on Miriam's transfer document as the date of Eliza Bell's supposed signature. Luke stood near the door. He watched the sheriff's finger move down the page. Once, then back up to be sure. The sheriff went very still. "There it is," Tate said quietly. He turned the ledger so Luke could see the entry. The county office had been closed for 7 consecutive days that week due to severe flood damage to the foundation. The closure was recorded in the clerk's own handwriting and countersigned by the county commissioner. No documents had been filed. No signatures had been witnessed. No official business of any kind had been conducted. The date on Miriam's transfer paper fell squarely in the middle of those 7 days. Luke looked at the entry. Then he looked at the sheriff. "It is forged," Luke said. "It is forged," Tate confirmed. He closed the ledger and picked up his hat from the table. "But the document itself is still in Miriam's hands, along with everything else she took this morning. We can testify to the date problem in court, but if she destroys those papers, before the circuit judge can examine them, we lose the physical evidence." Luke was already moving toward the door. The circuit judge was due to arrive at the church by midday. Half the town would already be gathered there. And Miriam Voss, with the stolen letters and the will and her Bible box, was heading straight for the middle of that crowd. The church bell had not yet rung for midday when the circuit judge's wagon rolled down the main street. People came out of the dry goods store, the feed barn, and the barber shop to watch it pass. A circuit judge arriving was always an event in a small town. It meant something official was about to happen, something that would be talked about for months afterward around supper tables and on front porches. Miriam Voss was already standing near the church steps when the wagon pulled up. She had dressed carefully. Her dark green dress was pressed and clean. Her hair was pinned smooth beneath a gray bonnet. She held her polished Bible box against her side with both hands, the brass clasp catching the pale morning light. From a distance, she looked exactly like what she had always appeared to be. Calm, respectable, devoted, but her eyes moved too much. They swept the road from one end to the other and back again. They lingered on the judge's wagon. They checked the faces of the people gathering on the church lawn, and every few seconds, without meaning to, they returned to the road that led out toward the old boarding house. She was watching for Luke. He arrived before she was ready for him. The group came up the road in a loose, muddy company. Luke rode the borrowed horse with his jaw set and his coat still damp from the morning rain. Sheriff Tate rode beside him, straight-backed and unhurried in the way of a man who has made his decision and is no longer in a rush because the decision is already made. Behind them came Martha's wagon with Clara sitting on the seat, her blue dress wrinkled and dirty at the hem, but her chin lifted. Behind the wagon came Pete and 2 other ranch hands and a handful of neighbors who had spent the morning searching creek roads and had seen enough to want to see the end of it. Rusty was with them. Luke had gone back for him before they left the boarding house yard. He had not explained why. He had simply untied the old red horse from the fence post, looped the lead rope through his saddle ring, and brought him along. Rusty followed without complaint, his white blaze bright against his red coat, his big, dark eyes steady. The townspeople near the church steps noticed them arrive. Conversations went quiet in clusters, spreading outward the way ripples spread from a stone dropped in still water. The circuit judge, a stout older man with white side whiskers and a leather satchel, climbed down from his wagon and looked at the approaching group with mild interest. He had seen many things in many towns. He did not appear alarmed. He appeared patient, in the particular way of men who have learned that the truth usually shows up eventually, though rarely on a convenient schedule. Miriam straightened when she saw Luke's face. Something shifted in her expression. Only for a moment. Then the soft, sorrowful look returned. the one she wore in public, like a second skin. She turned toward the judge and began moving up the church steps. She did not run. Running would have looked wrong. She moved with purpose, the Bible box tucked firmly under one arm, as though she simply meant to step inside and retrieve some document she had prepared in advance. As though this were all very routine and unfortunate, and she was simply a tired woman doing her Christian duty. She had made it to the second step when Rusty moved. Luke had not pulled the lead rope. He had not signaled the horse in any way anyone could see. Rusty simply walked forward out of the loose group, steady and unhurried, and placed himself directly across the church steps. He stood there the way old horses sometimes stand, like something planted, like something that has been in one place so long it has become part of the ground. Miriam stopped. She looked at the horse. Then she looked at the crowd. Then she pulled the Bible box tighter against her body and said, with trembling dignity, "Someone move this animal." Nobody moved. Sheriff Tate stepped forward. He did not reach for the horse. He reached for the Bible box. Miriam pulled back. "You have no right." "I have the circuit judge standing 10 feet behind me, and a forged document with your name on it," Tate said. His voice was not loud. It did not need to be. "Hand it over, Mrs. Voss." For one long moment, Miriam held on. Then her hands opened. Tate took the box and turned to face the judge and the gathered townspeople. He set it on the wide, flat railing of the church steps, worked the brass clasp, and lifted the lid. The crowd pressed forward. Inside, folded and stacked and carefully kept, were papers. Wills written in different hands. Property deeds with names that belonged to families in that very crowd. Savings notes. Guardianship transfer forms. A bundle of letters tied with kitchen string. The handwriting on the topmost envelope belonging to a woman named Eliza Bell. And beneath them all, pressed flat and protected by a piece of oilcloth, was a second signed copy of the original Bell family will, naming Clara May Bell as the rightful heir to the boarding house and the ranch parcel. The judge leaned in and looked. Then he looked at Miriam. Then he looked at Clara, who had stepped down from the wagon and was standing very still in her wrinkled blue dress, watching from the edge of the crowd with her mother's Bible page folded in her hand. Sheriff Tate lifted the first paper from the Bible box and read the name on it aloud. Thomas Greer, Creek Parcel, 40 acres. A woman near the back of the crowd made a small sound. She pressed her hand over her mouth and grabbed the arm of the man beside her. Tate lifted the next one. Margaret Hollis. Savings note, $62. An older man took off his hat. Tate kept going, name after name, document after document. Each one landed on the judge's table like a quiet stone dropped into deep water. The crowd did not murmur or shift. They went very still, the way people go still when something they should have seen a long time ago finally becomes impossible to look away from. Little Toby stood near the church fence with the other children from Voss House. He was wearing those 2 big boots. He did not know what a deed was, or what a creek parcel meant. But he could read a crowd, the way children who have lived in fearful places learn to do. He watched the faces of the adults around him, and understood that something important had just changed. Miriam stood on the church steps without moving. The soft, sorrowful expression she had worn all morning was gone. What was left underneath it was something harder. Something that had always been there and had simply been dressed up too well for anyone to notice. The judge studied each document in turn. He asked Tate 2 quiet questions. Tate answered them. The judge nodded once and made a note in his leather satchel. Then he looked at Miriam. "Mrs. Voss," he said, "these papers were not lost to fire. They were not donated. They were kept, by you, in that box." He paused. "That is not charity. That is theft." Miriam opened her mouth. For a moment it seemed she might perform one more time. Her chin trembled. Her eyes went glassy. But the crowd had already seen behind the curtain. Every wet eye and pressed lip in that churchyard belonged to someone who was thinking of a neighbor, a child, a widow, a name on one of those folded papers. There was no audience left for the performance. Tate arrested her quietly, without drama. He took her arm, and she did not fight it. She walked with him toward his office with her head down and the Bible box left open on the railing behind her. Reverend Voss did not move for a long time after his wife was gone. He stood near the church door with his hands at his sides and his face the color of old ash. Then he stepped forward, slowly, and faced the crowd. His voice was not strong, but it was honest, maybe for the first time in a long while. "I knew," he said. "Not all of it, but enough." He stopped and swallowed. "I told myself the children were cared for. I told myself it was not my place to question her methods. I told myself the charity she built brought good to this town." He looked at the papers on the table. What it brought was praise. For me. And I let that be enough. Nobody said anything. A few people looked at the ground. The Reverend's confession was not comfortable to hear, partly because it was true, and partly because more than one person in that crowd had ignored their own small doubts for the same reason. He stepped down from the church porch and walked toward Tate's office. The judge spent the rest of that afternoon at the table on the church lawn, working through each document with careful attention. He confirmed Clara's will as legitimate. He confirmed Miriam's transfer paper as forged. He appointed Sheriff Tate and Martha Reed as temporary trustees of the Bell property, and declared Clara May Bell its rightful heir until she came of age. One by one, families came forward to ask about names they had recognized. Some wept, some were angry, some simply stood quietly with the papers in their hands, trying to understand what had been taken and whether it could be returned. Some of it could. The judge made sure of that too. I hope you like this story. Please share what's your favorite part of the story and where in the world you are watching from. Have a wonderful day.